policy, all of our link arguments are predicated off of government action. Their focus, their framework collapses predictable ground and lacks a balanced literature-based killing. The argumentative development and research, infinite regression is a reason to err negative on these questions. The limitless nature of non-policy frameworks minimizes the education, destroys the quality of debate. Second is real-world change. Giving up on the political action is a bankrupt strategy. Our conference note evidence indicates that that policy focus is essential because it provides us with the tools and education needed to actually challenge the way the world works. I understand that we need to change as individuals, but the only way to do that is to make the portable skills that we get from being those skills allow us to challenge the way that things happen in the real world. We become policymakers, we become people that can advocate real change, and that change is critical. And we also have a defensive killer argument. We win the race of the middle. They can still run their argument in our framework. They have to prove a thoughtful plan that defends the resolutional action is good, which means that you can do things like the Johns Creek Gender Act that argues that we should do things to send people in space and argue against the oppression that NASA gives to people in space. You can also do things like argue against light pollution. These are all acts that people have run with hypothetical inaction where the negative in predictable sources of offense on top of it. And the framework is a reason to vote negative for fairness or debatability in education. There is a point where the 2 and R becomes impossible to give because they just spike out of all of our offense by saying the 1AC is just a metaphor, and they do not agree to our framework in the 2AC, and we have predicted our negative block strategy on 2AC choices, allowing them to concede framework in the 1AR would collapse competitive equity, which means they should err negative. But it's not enough to merely talk about something related to the resolution, defending the resolutional statement as it is, and defending that the United States federal government action is good is the only way to ensure fair debate where we can engage them. Otherwise, the affirmative can shift and dodge negative arguments rather than engage us. The resolutionally based learning is good, and we should be preserved. We change the topic every year in order to discuss a variety of issues, expanding our horizons if not tied to the resolution. The material that they present becomes impossible to predict and prepare for debate. This framework makes debate impossible. Shively in 2K, ambiguous, rejected, limited ideas, the mistake of thinking their agreement cannot contest the sense of kill debate. The some matters are not others. We can hold to certain truths, therefore we can agree about them. We cannot argue that something is not communicated, but if we cannot agree on the topic of terms or argument, if we agree that there's something can be debated about. The content is meaningless unless there is a lack of agreement or communication about what is being contested. Now they say that you affirm the topic as a metaphor. This is our argument. Simply reading the resolution does not make you topical. A ton of things can assert that they affirm the topic as something. They and then read advantages unrelated to decreasing federal authority. This argument links to all of our standards by eliminating predictable negative ground on literature and eliminating topical education. The only consistent interpretation is that the affirmative must instrumentally affirm the topic. Now they have also conceded the defensive arguments that you can either run this argument on the negative and still engage in that type of debate, or you can do it with a plan that defends the resolutional question as good. Now the vision of debate infavorably caters to the affirmative. The first is context. They can place anything in their advocacy in the context of their choosing. They can advocate the affirmative as a counterfactual or a narrative, depending on what arguments they want to avoid. The negative would never be able to prepare to debate every single option. This makes an infinitely regressive argument that they have not answered. Second is tautologies. This allows the affirmative to defend the claim as simple as harming people and harming other people bad, or extinction is bad, which makes negative being impossible, because especially when they defend things like racism is bad. I'm never going to say racism is good because it's clearly a bad thing, but it's impossible for me to engage in these types of debate that they do because they have agreed in something that's true, and it's impossible for me to engage in that type of debate too. Now they see the Mitchell evidence versus that Mitchell concludes negative later. The reason why he did this, he thinks that the debate space is not necessarily a laboratory, but it allows people to engage in forms of analysis that lets them engage in types of, engage in formula policy actions later. The draws parallels to things like the UDL, and it gave the ability for people who can participate in the UDL the ability to change policies in the future. This is a reason why you should err negative. Also saying that you should kill Mitchell is probably a little bit offensive, and you probably can't say that. Also, that probably, and also, yes, it does matter, and you don't meet our interpretation. Our argument is that the United States federal government is a governmental entity, which means that you must include governmental action. Even if you don't do this, all of these arguments, it does not matter. Our argument is simply that you must defend that resolutional action is good. The affirmative clearly defending the resolutional action in the division of space is bad. It's the reason why you should err heavily negative on this question. Their framework also begs the question of which exclusive forms of framework are okay, which makes framework a self-serving hypocrisy. Now, now they say the Louisville people shifted the focus. We're not saying that you cannot access these type of arguments, but we're saying that you should be able to access them in a way that gives the negative some sort of predictable offense that we can generate, some sort of ability to research your affirmative and ability to engage in you. And it's not necessarily that your affirmative is unpredictable, but the type of affirmatives that you allow are infinitely aggressive and unpredictable. That is not just an impact for fairness, an impact for predictable forms of debate, and forms of being able to talk about what they want to talk about in the one issue. Now say there's no impact to fairness, but fairness is to create a predictable class, predictable research education, and we need to engage in these types of fairness in order to engage in the types of conversations that they want us to engage in. In order to do that, it requires a literature base in order for us to engage in these types of policies. Now, to say fairness is unfair. It's not necessarily fairness. Our argument is simply that we need to engage in the types we need to engage in a finite form of resolutional actions in order to be able to engage in your form of debate. Their value is not true, even if we never become policymakers. A good understanding of government is important. As academics or theories about the state will become better, or other people in debate might become policymakers, and that causes better decision making in general. Even if you think that decision making in the status quo is bad, the forms of production that we can engage in only stem from the types of debate that we engage in, because the debate is focused in sort of a finite format that allows us to engage in the types of debate that they want us to. Now, this is Shively. It goes back in their advocacy argument is simply that we must engage in the forms of resolution, the idea that one thing is good, one thing is bad. Also, we would never know what is good or bad. The affirmative makes it impossible for us to know what is good or bad. We never know what it is they are arguing. We can never search for the truth value of things because we never understand what they are arguing. Now, secondly, the Shively evidence also makes the argument that we need to a stable point of truth in order to be able to engage in their advocacy. That is, and in fact, finally, they say debates encourage competition. Our argument is not that debates should encourage competition. Rather, you're right, that debates should encourage discussion, but that discussion can never happen in a world of the affirmative, because your affirmative allows an infinite number of ways that it becomes impossible for us to engage in that type of debate. Now, they make this standard argument on the capitalism flow, but I'll answer right here. They say the only argument is policy debate is bad. We think that policy debate is good. That's Donovan and Larkin. And O6 would be naive to assume that political science without the knowledge form of detailed study will simply affect the political process and simply discipline, much less ensuring the individual planes of work and ensuring a critical mass of unstable political science not guarantee, but productive research and guarantee what would happen. The aim of guaranteeing will not happen. They've also conceded our research is add to their interpretation. We never get forms of research that allow us to engage in the type of debate that they want us to engage in, because we are never able to do that research because their affirmative is not predictable. Will we have any cards on the sure. Do you have the app? Let's go to the advocacy. We'll be explaining a lot more about this advocacy, but the argument that they are allowed to sever their discourse is just not true. First is negation theory. In order to be negative, we need to affirm. The affirmative must defend their methodology, which means that they must defend the idea of discourses and the idea of the knowledge production, the claim from the vocabulary and the grammar of the status quo as being good. And secondly is that the judge, the one you should view the one as a rhetorical artifact, which means the affirmative are not allowed to sever their representations. None of these arguments make sense in the context of our interpretation when their evidence is just that fairness and when we need to challenge the white politics of the one you see. Yes, we understand that will be explained in the one hour, but the argument is just that you are not allowed to make arguments that sever your methodology. I guess that'll be there.
So, what happens if the judges vote neg at that round?
I guess they're endorsing the idea that we should have a predictable frame of offense predictable resolution in order to generate offense.
How does that affect the world outside of debate?
Sure. The argument is simply that when we have a resolutional question and the affirmative defends the resolutional question and the negative is able to say that that resolution is bad, then we are able to have a discussion about what
but you're not answering my question about how
Sure,
how
I'm getting to that. Okay. So we are able to have these discussions, and those discussions later lead to policymakers being able to correctly argue what it is.
So if the judges vote neg, you're going to automatically become a policymaker?
No, the argument is that when we grow up and we want to enact social change, even if we don't become policymakers, we become people that influence the way that we think.
That's cool. Can you give me like an empirical example of maybe like a policymaker that has enacted social change for people of color?
A policymaker?
Like sure, from a previous sphere, because it seems to me that the debaters that actually create some form of social change are the ones that debate alternatively.
I don't think I can name a specific example. The initial article that I read on one
So how-
actually indicates that BBL debaters that
How are you
do
being
these types of
excluded
things.
in this round?
How are we being excluded?
Is what? Yeah.
I don't think I made an exclusion argument. I think I've made
Okay, so
arguments
that's
about.
cool. I was just clarifying. So first you say that like you're like that role playing is good, but then you're not saying that then you say you're not role playing as policymakers. Rather, you're discussing like what the government should do.
We've never made the argument that role playing is good. Our argument is simply that as with the affirmative must argue that the resolution is good, and we must argue that the resolution is bad. We're not supposed to be policymakers if that's.
How can you
the argument
negate
is
the
simply that-
resolution is bad if we affirm it through like a metaphor? Why can't you still
affirming it as a metaphor is not
why
affirming
can't you
it.
still negate
Because
the resolution?
any offense that we make to the resolution will just be, oh, but our affirmative is a metaphor, so we don't link to that.
Okay.
Cool. Can you explain your answer to our standard evidence again?
The standard evidence basically indicates that policy debate is bad.
No,
Our
it
argument-
doesn't.
I've read the piece of evidence,
Yeah, it
and that's
doesn't.
my interpretation
But
of it.
keep going.
You're free to argue,
Sure, okay,
but
just keep going.
I guess our interpretation is that we need researchability and, that's not a word, but the ability to research and also
Can
the
you
ability to
answer
generate
it in more
offensive.
context of what it actually says, which is like the relationship that exists between your running framework and capitalism? Because that's what the text says. I want to hear an answer to like,
I don't understand what.
alright, can you answer the text of the card, not your interpretation, like what the
Well,
card
I don't know what the
actually
text says because my
Okay,
interpretation
but,
is.
okay, whatever, so you're
what I answered.
misinterpreting the
I
card.
guess.
Okay, Brittany, do you have any more questions?
I don't really understand like the bottom of the 2NC on the counter advocacy. Like, I don't understand.
You probably
just
won't
what
understand it until the 1 and R, so 4, 3, 2, 1.
That's
Yeah.
Will, one second. The winner of this round is going to stay here.